Kia ora kato katoa. I'm Charlie, and I'll be having a bit more of a sort of feminist discussion around this all. So I'm a member of the Lesbian Rights Alliance Aotearoa, so I sort of come from that group. I've spent the last few years really interested in the intersection between climate change and public health. This means looking at the facts which tell us the Earth is cooking and figuring out what that cooking looks like in real terms for real people. It's taught me a lot. At first, I thought we should all make individual choices to try to stop climate change, but I started realizing that some people had a lot more power than other people. People like Rex Tillerson with ExxonMobil could make damage like at a scale someone like me could never work at. So I realized I was going to need to start taking that into account. We see that in any oppressive system, some groups of people have way more power than other groups, right? And a good example of that is racism. So especially in New Zealand, post-colonisation, having white skin means you don't face certain barriers as you move through the world. It means you grow up thinking of yourself a certain way with certain expectations, opportunities, and understandings. You might face other challenges in your life, sure, but you're probably not going to face trouble because you are white. And I would argue that that's quite similar to the lack of barriers that that males face for being male. Okay, they might face barriers, but it's unlikely to be for that reason. After a while, working on climate stuff, I realised I'd never seen an executive board of a coal, oil or gas company that was made up entirely of women, but I'd often see those boards made up of men. I started thinking about social power and realised I was going to need to sort of sort my own analysis out, and I decided that power is about your degree of influence over other people and your degree of influence over their choices. So this bill, which proposes sex changes based solely on self-declaration, brings up a whole lot of questions about power, and I want to take some time to look at them. This law change is about complete demedicalisation of a legal sex change process. So it's about taking biology out of the concept of sex in law and redefining biological sex to be about identity, feelings, and sense of self. Females as a group did not consent to this redefinition of ourselves. So first I'm just going to lay out my terms, because I think what often happens with this discussion is that we use the same words to mean different things, and that's just not constructive. So here, sexism refers to how people are treated worse on purpose or less favourably than a person of the other sex, and to measure sexism, the comparator is somebody of the other sex. And what is gender? I describe it as the cultural and social value, expectations, and limitations that are placed on your sex. So it's the idea that males should be masculine and they should be dominant over females who should be feminine and subordinate to those males. It's a social, cultural construct that I think most people follow. So as feminists, we understand that we were born into a sexist society, but the women are not innately feminine and men are not innately masculine. Some gender activists claim that your sex reflects who you are. That's why they want to see legal sex changes. Legal sex change to reflect identity. But if you try to describe the word woman by anything other than biology, you quickly end up referring to stereotypes, sexist stereotypes. As feminists, we have to reject that. We don't want your sex to dictate your opportunities, your personality, or your expression. We want to end stereotypes and discriminations based on sex, but we don't want to deny that sex exists. I mean, abortion isn't even 100% legal in New Zealand yet, so being female matters. I think it's great that women like Laura O'Connell-Rapira from the NGO Action Station are bringing up Indigenous genders, because it reminds us that Māori pre-colonisation didn't have a corrupt and brutal arrangement of power on the basis of sex like we do. It shows us that a world beyond sexism is possible. But ignoring sex while we're in a world where that matters is like saying, I'm colourblind to racism, but with sexism. If sexism is ended, I'd really like to know when and how. It would be cool to know. In 2016, over 5,000 applications were made for protection orders in New Zealand, close to 90% by females against males. Up to 1 in 3 girls will be subject to sexual assault by males by the age of 16 years in New Zealand. The majority of those incidents would be considered serious. 1 in 3 New Zealand women are sexually assaulted in our lifetime, and men are likely to repeat that crime. An estimated 9% of those incidents are reported to police, and only 13% of that 9% will ever result in conviction. These facts mean that having a conversation about how women's rights are affected by any law change is legitimate. Talking about the root of women's oppression by men is not transphobic, and the hostility towards any woman who critiques so much as the design of the policy says a lot. We need to look at the way we are treating women who say no. I look at the statistics of male violence against women and feel grief, and I should. Some people say this violence is by men and not trans women because trans women are women. But we all know that trans women are male because only males can be trans women. And we know that with self-declared sex changes, there is no way to know the difference between a male who identifies as genuinely trans and a male that doesn't, if they both claim to. Is it bigoted for women to want female space free of males? I truly don't think so. Sometimes the only people who can understand what you're going through or who you need or who you want to be around are other women. Something I struggle with in this conversation is this demand to tell personal stories to try and justify why I might want to keep the laws that we have in place to protect women. I've been to activism school. I know that when we connect our backyard flooding in South Dunedin to children unable to grow up in their family homes in the Marshall Islands because of rising seas, we get heard. Telling compelling stories matters, but at whose expense? I'm uncomfortable that women should be pressured to disclose stories of male violence when we know how common it is. It should be taken seriously from the get-go. To write women off if they won't say that they've been raped is unfair. I spoke about this with my friend Renee Gerlich, and she said, "We should be creating a feminist movement so strong that women don't have to tell their stories and risk re-traumatizing themselves in order to be heard." I think the story with this bill is ultimately a story of making light of women's boundaries. Yesterday, Chloe Sorbick, an MP in the Green Party, wrote, "Words lose meaning if we expand their application to include the logical opposite of their definition." And that's the heart of the issue here. Are we ready to lose a clear definition of the word female? We use language to communicate boundaries. Eroding language makes it harder to maintain a boundary. Women asserting their boundaries, whether linguistic, sexual, political, or legal, is almost always met with hostility. Whether it's the Lesbian Rights Alliance being told lesbian equals female homosexual is transphobic, the words suffragists fought for the female sex being called violent, or us wanting to protect the right to have a lesbian support service being called biphobic. All of this is women sort of setting some boundaries and having those framed as problematic. Our autonomy matters. All these things happened to us in the last 2 weeks. I spoke to another friend today about this, and she said, boundaries mean freedom when you're in a marginalised group. And that was interesting. It made me reflect on this quote from Broadsheet magazine. What are the consequences of denying unconditional access to lesbian spaces? Lesbians will be empowered to say no to access to our bodies and spaces. We will be empowered to make our thoughts, feelings, and ideas primary without shame and guilt. And I think shame and guilt are being leveraged pretty hard against women right now. In the feminist movement, it's always been important to name the problem male violence. And right now, women who do that are being stigmatized, shamed, and harassed. The Human Rights Commission, somehow forgot to check how self-declaration of legal sex would impact females. Maybe because they were too busy dealing with that whole sexual harassment scandal. Just kidding, the man still works there. Government MPs like Jan Logie, Marama Davidson, Kerry Allen, Louisa Wall are all consistently framing any woman with concerns as transphobic tourists. This in turn makes other women afraid to speak up. Leah Keith from Deep Green Resistance has said, in the battered women's movement, it's generally acknowledged that one beating a year keeps a woman down. Men beat women 400,000 times a year at least in New Zealand. Women are already being kept down. I maintain that it's only because this male violence against women has become so normalised that it's practically invisible that this law change can be framed as anything but the removal of women's hard-fought-for legal protections. We don't take what's happening to women seriously enough. I don't know how so many people have obviously not asked themselves this question. What's more likely? That a load of lifelong, left-leaning, LGBT-supporting women have inexplicably and uncharacteristically all suddenly become bigots, or that perhaps you might be missing something here. Peace.